teenage girl falls to the pavement, her white jacket stained with blood, in the middle of downtown Toronto's busiest shopping street on Boxing Day. A few years later, a bullet rips through a backyard birthday party, killing an 11-year-old boy. Entire apartment complexes are sealed off at dawn as police swarm stairwells with rifles drawn. In the shadow of Canada's largest city, a silent war was taking shape, one rooted not in ideology or politics, but in geography, pride, and pain. If you've ever wondered how a city as polished as Toronto could give rise to such grim realities, stay with us. What you're about to hear isn't just a history of crime. It's a quiet descent into desperation, loyalty, and power. Leave a comment, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, especially if you're from the neighborhoods we'll speak about tonight. Your story matters too. This is Classified Crimes, where intellect reveals truth and empathy guides the story. Toronto has always been a city of edges, not just in skyline, but in survival. In the early 2000s, its outer boroughs were undergoing subtle but significant shifts. Government-subsidized housing projects like those in Mount Dennis, Rexdale, and Jane and Finch were becoming isolated enclaves, each with their own sense of place, pride, and increasingly territory. From these spaces emerged a generation of youth facing limited opportunity and growing disillusionment. In this pressure cooker, loyalty offered protection, and identity came bundled with affiliation. It was in this crucible that the FivePoint Generals were born. Their base, the Twin Towers high-rise buildings at Weston Road and Lawrence Avenue West. The group's roots ran deep in Mount Dennis, a neighborhood shaped by industrial decline and urban neglect. By the mid-2000s, the FivePoint Generals, or 5PGZ, were no longer just a rumor. They were becoming a force. Not long after, just a few subway stops away, another name was gaining weight, the Driftwood Crips. They called the Jane and Finch area home, a region long associated with media headlines, though few knew the actual people behind those stories. Driftwood was tight-knit, fiercely proud, and increasingly involved in street-level drug trade and retaliatory violence. But perhaps no group would rise to such infamy, at least publicly, as the Dixon Bloods. Their base of operations, a cluster of apartment buildings around Dixon Road and Kipling Avenue in the Kingsview Village area. Unlike the 5PGZ and Driftwood Crips, who evolved from local neighborhood loyalty, the Dixon Bloods had stronger international connections. Some of its members were first- or second-generation immigrants from Somalia and West Africa. What they brought and what they became would soon change the city's understanding of street gangs. The first major flashpoint arrived in 2005. Downtown Toronto, Boxing Day, 15-year-old Jane Kreba, out shopping with family, was caught in crossfire between rival groups. She was struck and killed in broad daylight. 7 others were wounded. The public was horrified. The media exploded. Toronto was stunned. Investigators eventually determined that the Boxing Day shooting involved rival groups from Regent Park, the Silent Soldiers and Point Blank Soldiers, along with members of the Eglinton West Crips. What began as a dispute tied to internal gang dynamics spilled violently into the city's downtown core. Suddenly, these weren't just neighborhood beefs. They were a public safety crisis. Toronto police began to shift strategy. Task forces were formed. Surveillance intensified. Raids would follow in the years to come, but the seeds had been planted, and underground, the gangs were watching each other, counting bodies and moves, preparing for the next phase. Among those growing in influence were the Dixon Bloods. By 2011, intelligence units had flagged the group as more than just a local gang. Police surveillance and wiretaps began to reveal a more structured operation, trafficking guns, cocaine, and heroin across city lines, with reported supply routes stretching as far as Windsor and Edmonton. Their model resembled that of traditional organized crime. What set them apart was speed and audacity. One of their hideouts, a unit in 320 Dixon Road, would later become infamous. It was from here, investigators alleged, that much of their trafficking operations were coordinated. And it was here, too, that a wider controversy began to surface. one that would eventually pull the mayor's name into headlines. In 2013, a covert surveillance operation named Project Traveler would send shockwaves through Toronto. At 5 a.m. on June 13th, police in riot gear executed over 30 search warrants. Helicopters circled overhead. Flashbangs shattered silence. By sunrise, 43 people had been arrested, many with ties to the Dixon Bloods. Police recovered over 40 firearms, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and nearly $3 million in narcotics. Among those arrested was Mohammed Syed, a Dixon Bloods member who secretly filmed then-Mayor Rob Ford smoking crack cocaine. Police recovered the video during the Project Traveler raids, a discovery that turned a local gang investigation into an international scandal. While Ford later admitted to using crack cocaine, no court ever linked him criminally to the gang. Yet, for Toronto, the headlines blurred the lines between street crime and City Hall. While this storm was unfolding in the west, other battles were intensifying in the city's north. The Driftwood Crips had by now established themselves not just as a presence, but as a reputation. Their name evoked fear in nearby blocks, especially in the surrounding areas of Jane and Finch, where other rival crews also vied for control. Tensions between these crews simmered, sometimes erupting into drive-bys, sometimes into silent retaliation. Then came another tragedy. In 2007, Ephraim Brown, just 11 years old, was shot and killed during a backyard birthday party. The shooters, aiming for rivals in what police described as a gang-related attack, missed. The bullet hit Ephraim instead. Once again, the public mourned. And once again, the question was asked, how had it come to this? By the end of this first decade, from 2005 to 2015, Toronto had witnessed the evolution of its gang landscape from street-based identity to hybrid criminal enterprises. And while names like FivePoint, Driftwood, and Dixon dominated headlines, what lay beneath was something more complex, a generation navigating neglect, chasing status, and stepping into roles once shaped for survival, now hardened into structure. There were no easy answers, but within law enforcement, the momentum was shifting. A few years later, in 2018, authorities would launch one of their largest operations to date, aimed squarely at the FivePoint generals. This time, it wasn't just about arrests. It was about dismantling an ecosystem. But that is a chapter for later. These were not just stories of crime. They were stories of environment, choices, and the steep cost of influence. And they were only beginning. By the mid-2010s, the silence before dawn in Toronto was often broken by the roar of battering rams and the synchronized rhythm of police boots storming stairwells. These were not random raids. They were carefully coordinated offensives, the result of months, sometimes years of surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover infiltration. The stakes were high, and so were the casualties. The gang landscape had evolved, and with it, the magnitude of violence and response. One such response came on June 21, 2018. Toronto Police, along with Ontario Provincial Police and the RCMP, executed Project Patton, a sweeping operation targeting the FivePoint generals. At 5 a.m., teams descended on nearly 100 locations. The goal wasn't just arrests, it was dismantlement. By day's end, 75 people had been arrested. Authorities had seized 78 firearms, large quantities of cocaine, fentanyl, and carfentanil, a synthetic opioid so potent it's used to sedate elephants. More than 1,000 charges were laid. The FivePoint generals weren't just known for drug trafficking and gun running. Over the years, they became associated with a series of violent conflicts across Toronto, forcing police to treat gang activity as organized crime rather than street-level disputes. But taking down major players didn't erase old grudges. If anything, it reignited them. And yet, as law enforcement intensified, so too did the retaliations. In 2019, a shooting in Mississauga at a family gathering left one teenager dead and 5 others injured. The motive, police suggested, was a feud between rival groups operating across Toronto and Peel region. The location may have changed, but the trigger remained the same: territory, revenge, respect. At the center of many of these conflicts were long-standing grudges, sometimes between groups, sometimes within them. The Dixon Bloods, for instance, had once operated as a tightly woven crew, controlling parts of Etobicoke with strategic efficiency. But after Project Traveler in 2013 and the follow-up Project Clean Slate, fractures began to appear. Some members were imprisoned, others splintered off, forming microcrews or allying with different networks altogether. Police began noticing a shift in how newer groups organized, less hierarchical, more fluid, and often connected through social media or short-lived alliances. Whereas the older groups had initiation rituals and defined codes, the newer cells were unpredictable, more violent, less traceable. One of the clearest examples of this new breed emerged from Scarborough. The Chester Lee Gang, based near Victoria Park and Finch, had been active since the mid-2000s. But by late 2018, they were increasingly on law enforcement's radar for their alleged role in distributing guns and fentanyl across Toronto, the GTA, and the rest of the country. Enter Project Kraken. Launched after a string of overdoses and gun-related homicides, the operation targeted what police described as a gun pipeline, illegal firearms being trafficked from the United States through Ontario's border points, landing in Chester Lee-controlled territories. The results were staggering. 73 people were arrested. 23 firearms were seized. Among the items found were loaded handguns with extended magazines, high-capacity rifles, and modified Glock switches. Devices that could turn a pistol into a fully automatic weapon. What made Project Kraken particularly alarming wasn't just the arsenal. It was the clientele. Wiretap evidence revealed that Chester Lee members were selling to other gangs across Ontario, from Hamilton to Ottawa. This wasn't about turf anymore. It was about supply and control. Still, perhaps the most chilling transformation of Toronto's gang culture wasn't in hardware or the drugs. It was in the visibility. Once, gangs operated in the shadows. Their codes were unspoken. Their movements discreet. Violence was whispered in hallways, not flaunted for an audience. But that era is over. Today, allegiances are broadcast online. Instagram videos flashing stacks of cash. Snapchat clips of masked faces naming enemies. Rap lyrics doubling as threats. What began as bravado turned into evidence and then into funerals. When posts become evidence, retaliation becomes theater. Police now call it the new battleground, not street corners but social feeds. A single upload can spark a war. People have died over an Instagram post, says Marcel Wilson, a former gang leader turned anti-violence advocate. It's not about money anymore. It's about reputation, respect, and views. And the consequences? They've been deadly. In 2018, rapper Twan Robertson opened fire on a Scarborough playground after an Instagram diss. 2 little girls, ages 5 and 9, were caught in the hail of bullets. In another case, Jermaine Dunkley, better known as J Noble, leader of the Monstars, recorded a rap response video daring rivals to confront him. That digital taunt didn't stay online. Within weeks, the feud erupted into at least 10 shootings and 2 homicides. Experts warn this isn't just posturing, it's a currency. Every view, every share fuels a cycle where humiliation demands retaliation. As Wilson puts it, the old rule was, if it doesn't make dollars, it doesn't make sense. Now, it doesn't have to make sense, as long as it gets views. Still, not all was retaliation. Some were just caught in the crossfire. In early 2020, 28-year-old Jamal Francique was fatally shot by a police officer in Mississauga during a police operation targeting alleged drug activity. The case sparked protests and renewed debates about policing and accountability. Francique was never proven to be involved in any criminal enterprise. His family insisted he was turning his life around. The case became emblematic of a broader question. Where does surveillance end and profiling begin? As tensions escalated between gangs and police, and among communities themselves, a new name began circulating, the Jamestown Crips. Operating primarily in Toronto's West End, The Jamestown crew had remained relatively under the radar until Project Fox, a sprawling 2023 investigation that exposed how the group was trafficking meth and cocaine across provinces, using the Canada Post system to ship drugs as far as Newfoundland and Manitoba. 32 people were arrested. 9 firearms were seized, along with $320,000 in cash. Police called it one of the most efficient distribution networks they'd seen: low profile, low violence, and high profit. But it was also a turning point. No longer were gangs confined to city blocks or apartment stairwells. Their reach had gone national. Their operations mirrored corporations, regional managers, delivery networks, product movement. What had begun as street-based affiliations had, over 2 decades, morphed into logistical syndicates. And yet behind every firearm seizure and every press conference, there were quieter stories. Of mothers visiting their sons in detention centers, of young men stepping out of jail, only to find no place left to go, of survivors attending funerals of both friends and enemies. Beneath the statistics were scars, deep, personal, and often unspoken. By 2023, Toronto police reported that overall gang-related shootings had decreased compared to the peak years. But they cautioned against complacency. The threat hadn't vanished. It had shifted. The alliances were more fluid, the methods more discreet, the violence more targeted, and in that silence, a dangerous calm. In the next chapter, we'll walk into that silence. We'll follow the aftermath, the fractured networks, the quiet survivors, the ones left behind. We'll see how trauma reverberates long after the sirens fade, and what it truly costs to belong. The morning after a raid is always quieter than the night before. Neighbors peek from behind curtains. Yellow tape flutters in the wind. Children walk to school past shattered doors and news cameras. And inside those apartments, once filled with movement, shouts, and coded plans, the air turns still. This is what the aftermath looks like. When Project Patton ended and the mugshots of the FivePoint generals splashed across screens, Toronto felt a momentary sense of relief. Guns had been seized, leaders arrested. Streets, for now, seemed calmer. But dismantling a gang is not the same as healing a neighborhood. In Mount Dennis, a mother described walking her son past the police tape outside their building. "I told him they're just cleaning up," she said. "But he asked me, what if they come back? I didn't know how to answer." That fear, that ambiguity, it lingered, because even after the headline fades, even after the gang's name becomes a memory, the trauma remains stitched into the fabric of the community. Some of those arrested never returned. Some did, changed. Others were replaced. In the vacuum left by dismantled groups, new crews emerged, younger, faster, and often more volatile. One detective described it as cutting off the head of a hydra. You take down one set of players, and 2 more rise in their place, often without the structure or rules of their predecessors. This was especially true in the wake of Project Traveler and the fall of the Dixon Bloods. The group never fully recovered from the 2013 crackdown. Some members were sentenced to years in prison, others scattered, forming microcrews or retreating from street life altogether. But the territory they once held, the clusters of high-rises along Dixon Road, didn't remain unclaimed. Instead, the void opened space for smaller, decentralized crews. These younger groups, often connected through schoolyards and social media, lacked the hierarchy of the older bloods. They were less predictable and far more impulsive. One former gang member, interviewed anonymously by a CBC documentary team, described the shift this way. "Back in the day, you had rules. You don't touch kids. You don't shoot on holidays. Now, they don't care. It's not loyalty anymore. It's desperation." Desperation had always been part of the equation, but now it had become the fuel. The same could be said for the Driftwood Crips, whose once feared name had fragmented into loosely affiliated groups by the early 2020s. Internal conflicts, arrests, and shifting alliances splintered their influence. But while the names changed, the geography did not. Jane and Finch, Rexdale, Weston, Scarborough. The map of Toronto's gang landscape remained largely unchanged, not because of failure in policing, but because the roots of the problem were deeper than any indictment could reach. Many community leaders began to voice what residents had long known. Enforcement alone wouldn't fix what created these gangs in the first place. Poverty, displacement, intergenerational trauma, lack of access. These weren't just social issues, they were soil. And in that soil, desperation grew. Programs were launched, youth initiatives, mentorship networks, community hubs. Some worked, others were underfunded. A few became lifelines for the lucky ones who found them in time. But for many, change came too late. There's a certain rhythm to gang life that often goes unnoticed by outsiders. It starts small. A friend introduces you to a crew. Maybe they have your back at school. Maybe they help you sell something on the corner. Maybe they protect you from someone else. Then one day, you're holding a bag, or a gun, or standing beside someone who is. And the moment that happens, something shifts. You've crossed an invisible line. In the post-raid silence, some of those who crossed that line began to rethink their path. A few sought new lives, moved cities, found trades, started families. But others didn't, because it's not easy to walk away from a world that taught you everything you know about survival. Some who left were pulled back by debt, or blackmail, or fear. Some disappeared. Others ended up on street corners they no longer recognized, where the faces were younger, the codes different, and the consequences quicker. It's easy to look at mugshots and forget that behind every alias is a name, a history, a choice, sometimes terrible, sometimes inevitable. And not all stories end in prison. Some end in silence. The old rhythm of gunfire may have faded from the headlines, but the threat never disappeared. It evolved. Yet behind every parcel shipped, there was a human cost. A home poisoned by meth. A teenager overdosed. A mother waiting at the door for someone who would never return. Toronto's gang story was never just about crime. It has always been about cycles. How violence becomes silence, how silence hides scars, and how those scars shape generations. And in the spaces left behind, alleys, stairwells, community centers, new stories are still being written. Some of them are stories of redemption. Over the years, many former gang members have taken steps toward a different future. These examples, drawn from past reports, show what change can look like. Jose Alejandro Vivar became known for founding 24/7 Fitness and launching the prison pump program, using fitness and public speaking to steer youth away from violence. Marcel Wilson, once a West End gang leader, created the One by One movement, sharing his story to mentor youth and advise on anti-violence strategies. Richard Atkinson, after serving decades behind bars, turned his life toward boxing, art, and youth guidance. Jason Wisdom, formerly with the Galloway Boys, joined Think Twice, speaking to teens about the reality of gang life. Edward Hertrick authored Wasted Time and became an advocate for rehabilitation and second chances. Adam Ellis transformed his experience into research, pursuing a PhD in criminology to study trauma and violence. And these are only a few. There are countless others who have walked away from the shadows and built lives of meaning, not just surviving, but inspiring. These aren't headlines. They are legacies, because even in the darkest corners, something human remains. As the city evolves, so do its challenges. The lines are blurrier now, the enemies less visible, the weapons quieter. But beneath it all, the same questions echo. What makes someone pick up a gun? What makes someone put it down? And who carries the weight of both? Thank you for watching this episode of Classified Crimes. If you found it compelling, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the powerful stories we have coming next.